Hello, everyone. I'd like to take a closer look at the week 4 reading from Anselm's Proslogion, commonly known as the ontological argument, and very famous argument in the history of philosophy, as I said in the previous videos, but also maybe and a challenging argument, and notoriously difficult argument. But also, in a certain sense, easier for us because it's an identifiable argument. It's a short piece which contains an argument which is, different from I think all of the things we've read so far. Insofar as it is just that. I mean, Russell and Plato and Descartes, there were arguments there, but it was difficult. I think, especially in the first 2 weeks, to put a definite frame around where the argument was. Whereas this week, I think you can do that. I think that there's definitely an argument here, which is identifiable and manageable, in which we can, I think, identify both the conclusion fairly easily and the supporting reasoning. One of the things I would suggest after you do one of these readings is ask yourself first, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to put over? What is the big point? And underline that. And maybe literally underline it in the text, but definitely underline it in your mind. You make certain choices about what the goal is. What is this text trying to do? And I think if we look at this piece from Anselm, we could say two things that are plausible in terms of what he's trying to do. One would be to say that he's trying to prove the existence of God. I think that'd be perfectly legitimate as a statement of what the point is, what the conclusion is. What is it that the author is trying to prove? That he's trying to prove the existence of God. But maybe we would get more particular than that and say, well, to say that he's trying to prove the existence of God is too loose. And we could say that he's trying to prove the existence of a being greater than which no other can be thought. And it would be good to write that down. A being greater than which no other can be thought. He puts it, and this, we believe, he says here, let me make it a little bigger. It says here in the second paragraph, we believe that you are a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Another way of putting it. So one might say, and I think perhaps at a certain point you have to say that what he's trying to prove is that a being greater than which nothing, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist. So I think that that's pretty, I mean, to say that he's trying to prove the existence of God is true, but God, only if God is, amongst other things perhaps, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, which is what the argument is actually about, that idea, that conception of a being greater than which nothing can be conceived. So to get an idea of what he's doing is just to get an idea. Every week we're doing that. That's the thing. I mean, what would I underline here? Like this is the point. And this is very important because when you evaluate an argument, what you're always doing is evaluating how well the author actually proved that thing that you've underlined. I can't say that strongly enough. Is the toughest part, I think, of the assignments so far that I've seen from students is doing a good job in evaluating that. You underline what you take to be the main point, and then in your critical evaluation, what you're doing is evaluating how well or how badly the author actually established that point. So when we look at Anselm's argument and we say that what he's trying to establish is that a being than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist, we're evaluating how well Anselm actually prove that. So how does he try to prove it? Well, the key, I suppose the first key move is what he says at the end of this second paragraph in reference to the fool. And the fool is just a way to refer to the atheist. He says, but at any rate, this very fool, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his understanding. So that's maybe the first step, that we can conceive of a being than which nothing greater can exist. A being than which nothing greater can be conceived. That we have that idea, we can conceive clearly of that idea, and when we do, it is in our understanding, in our intellect. So that's the first step, and it's highly questionable, I would suppose, that we can even conceive of such a thing, and it's questionable even what it means to be in our understanding, whether that's a metaphor or whether it's to be taken literally. I suppose it's to be taken literally. But that's the first step, is that we can conceive of such a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. And when we conceive of it, it is in our understanding. And he explains what he means there in the next paragraph when he talks about the painter conceiving of a painting before they paint it. And at that moment, it is in their understanding, but it's not in reality. It is in the understanding. And then when they go ahead and paint it and actually carry out this idea, it is both in their understanding and in reality now, because they painted the picture. So this distinction of something existing only as a conception in your mind, in the understanding, as opposed to existing also in reality, is an important distinction, and also another questionable distinction, I would say, whether that's actually clear, whether that actually makes sense. But that's the starting point of the argument, that something can exist in the mind as a conception without existing in reality, like the painter's conception of the painting before he paints it, or before they paint it, excuse me. So he continues there in the next paragraph, hence even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. Again, reiterating that first premise of the argument. For when he hears of this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. That is, if we understand the very idea of a being greater than which nothing can be conceived, then it must exist as an idea, as a conception, in our understanding. And the question is, does it also exist in reality? That is there such a being? We can conceive of such a being, but does such a being actually exist in reality, that is independent of our conception of it, as opposed to the mere conception of it in our mind? Clearly I can conceive of things that don't exist in reality. I can conceive of a human being that's 30 feet tall, but that is only a conception in my mind and does not exist in reality, right? So this conception of the being than which nothing greater can be conceived, is it like that? My conception of a 30-foot tall person? Or is it also something that must exist in reality as well? And the next move there is where he says in the same paragraph, and assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. So he's making this assertion that this conception cannot be merely in the understanding alone, that it must exist also in reality. Why? Because it has to provide a reason for that. He says, for suppose it exists in the understanding alone. So that is, suppose that this being than which nothing greater can be conceived only exists in the understanding and not in reality. Then he says, it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. That is, if I conceive of something than which nothing greater can be conceived, but I say it only exists in the mind and not in reality, then I can also conceive of a being greater than which nothing can be conceived, which also exists in reality. I can conceive of that. So what follows from that? He says, well, therefore, if that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. That is, I can also conceive of such a being. I can conceive of such a being that does exist in reality. And that second conception would be greater than the original conception, because if it existed in reality, that would make it greater than the one that merely existed in the mind. But that would mean that the original conception of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived is also at the same time a being than which a greater can be conceived, because I can conceive of this other being which exists in reality too. Then he says, but obviously this is impossible. That is, it involves a logical contradiction. We said that we had this idea of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. But as it turns out, if indeed it doesn't exist in reality, then it is also this conception, a being than which a greater can be conceived. So it leads to a contradiction. It would mean that I am conceiving of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and at the same time, than which a greater can be conceived. So it leads to this absurdity. That is, I think what he's saying is, if I do actually have this conception in my mind, then to avoid contradiction, I cannot say that it merely exists in my understanding. It must also exist in reality. But obviously this is impossible because it leads to a contradiction of the fundamental laws of logic, the principle of non-contradiction, actually. Hence, there is doubt. As I said before, hence there is no doubt, it should say, that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. It's almost as if the very idea of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived demands, in Anselm's argument, that it also exists in reality and not just in the understanding. Otherwise, we're led to this contradiction. So I would say that if you look at the argument, what he has proved, if his proof is good, is that a being than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist in reality and not just in the understanding. It must exist in its own right. For Anselm, this is a proof for the existence of God, because he says this is how we conceive of God. Only God could be such a being. But to be precise about it, what this argument actually proves, if it proves anything, is that a being than which nothing greater can be conceived can exist in the mind. It must also exist in reality, that is independent of the mind. This is the best I can do. I'm not an expert on the ontological argument. There are people who are. There are people who write whole books about the ontological argument, and it has its partisans. It has people who really think it's a good argument, and has people who think it's the silliest argument in the world. But there it is. So tough argument, but an extremely interesting one, I think, and very famous one in the history of philosophy and theology in the West, Christian theology.